Welcome back in Live Now. I'm Austin Westfall. Take a look. Today, Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson signing an executive order aimed at resisting potential actions of the Trump administration amid fears that the White House will deploy National Guard troops to the city. Chicago city officials saying that they are concerned that the National Guard troops will be deployed to combat crime in the city, and they're also concerned about the potential of more immigration enforcement activity in the Windy City as well. Host of the Strat podcast, Hal Kempfer, still joining me here. Hal, can the city stop the federal government if it wants to? What levers do they have to do such a thing if they can?
Well, honestly, Austin, not much. And it's interesting. I have to tell you, this is more about the press conference, the announcement, the headlines, and a lot less about what they can actually do. Couple of things. Chicago and Washington, D.C. are completely different cities. Washington, D.C. is a federal district. There is a provision within the Home Rule Act which actually gives the president the ability to federalize the police force within Washington, D.C., because it is a federal district. And they have home rule up to a mayor, city council, but they don't have congressmen, they don't have senators, they're not a state. Chicago is in a state under the 10th Amendment. It has certain sovereign rights that are incumbent upon a state. It is a city within that state. It is a declared sanctuary city. And so he's put this initiative. First off, he says that he won't allow them to federalize the Chicago Police Department. I don't know of any legal method or whatever, where the federal government could actually federalize the Chicago Police Department. It's just not something that they can do there. So I just found that to be rather interesting that he said that, but it means completely nothing as far as I'm concerned in terms of structural capability to do that. They are talking about moving in there's been discussion about rolling in the National Guard. He's kind of, Mayor Brendan Johnson's kind of making it look like the Guard is going to come in and patrol the city and stuff. Again, different than Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C., federal district. There's different rules because it's federal territory. Chicago is not. And so they can't go in there and say back up local police department in doing certain things because there's been no request to do so. And the only way the president could do that would be to declare the Insurrection Act. And at that point, the military federalized military could come in and actually do some law enforcement actions. I don't know of any plan to invoke the Insurrection Act on Chicago, but it is a sanctuary city. There is a plan to do a lot of immigration enforcement. They are opening up a camp just north of an immigration detention facility, I should say, just north of Chicago, on the Great Lakes Naval Facility. I've actually been there. I actually trained their staff on doing crisis action planning, so I'm pretty familiar with that base. There is room there to do some stuff. So he's doing a lot of these things that just they don't quite fit in a Chicago context like they fit in a DC context, and he's kind of making a connective analogy. And he says they're going to try and do stuff legally that can obstruct the deployment of National Guard troops or military troops in Chicago, and also block some of this immigration enforcement. And that's where it gets really interesting. If he does something where the police department is actively stopping federal law enforcement or stopping the lawful deployment of federalized military troops in Chicago, I don't know, but I can tell you that lawyers at the White House will probably be looking at that and say, did he just do something that falls under the provisions of insurrection, and could the president declare the Insurrection Act? Nobody's talked about that yet, but I will say that within this initiative that he's just talked about, he's kind of opened a door, and it's going to, it's not so much what they're saying, it's what they're going to do. And if they do stuff like put up roadblocks or do something else, or heaven forbid, something kinetic, which would be, I just have to say, that'd be the dumbest thing for a city to do ever, would be to fight federal law enforcement or federal troops. I just can't imagine that happening. But just the language alone, I almost get the sense that if there was some intent to impose the Insurrection Act, that Mayor Johnson may have just kind of walked into a trap if there was ever any intent to do so. And I'm not saying there is, but that part of it really disturbed me when I saw that part where they said they're going to obstruct what's going on there, because the president can send federalized troops into Chicago. He can't use them for law enforcement, but he can. They can secure buildings, do all sorts of stuff, just like they did in Los Angeles. That was legal. Wasn't politically popular at the state or the city, but it was legal.
Live look at one of the most heavily visited tourist sites in the Windy City. Looks like our image is sputtering a little bit there, of the Bean in Chicago, just past 3:30 Central Standard Time. Mayor Johnson, Hal, I'll just read a little bit more context about the executive order that Mayor Johnson signed today. As you've alluded to, it's titled the Protecting Chicago Initiative. He says that it aims to inform residents of their rights and how to, quote, utilize legal action and legislation to prevent any attempts to systematically violate the rights of Chicagoans, unquote. We are not lawyers, but in general, Hal, what are federal officers or troops allowed to do and not allowed to do? Why does the mayor feel like it's important to use that kind of language?
It actually is kind of by using that language, it's basically alluding that somehow federal law enforcement is going to start violating their rights, their constitutional rights, civil rights, privacy rights, or something like that. And it kind of puts that out there as almost an implied thing that that's going to happen. We can look at what's happening in Washington D.C. Again, different situation, but I haven't seen where they've been going in and really violating stuff. In fact, in one case, it was recently filmed, I think yesterday, where immigration officials, I didn't see any federal troops around, although I will tell you that anymore they wear so much military garb. The law enforcement, federal law enforcement wears, you know, camouflage flak or ballistic vests and everything else. I had to look close just to make sure that none of them were actually any National Guard. Didn't see any, but they knocked on a door of a place they suspected there might be illegal immigrants. They did not have a search warrant. They did not have probable cause, I guess, necessary for a search warrant. The resident would not let them in, and they were enforced. But they were frustrated, and eventually they had to go away. And I saw that, I go, well, that's kind of how the system works. If you can't go in, you can't go in. And that's the same way it should work in Chicago, which is they could go out there and do a lot of things similar to what they've been doing in Los Angeles and other places where they've been finding places where they think illegal immigrants are, and detaining, arresting them, detaining them, if you will, and holding them, and then processing them through the system. They could do that, but they can't violate the law, if you will, in terms of harassing people or doing stuff like that. But they can do that, and I think it's more of a political statement than an actual functional statement. I don't know that people are not trying to protect their rights on any given day, but it is putting that out there, and it's going to energize the system. You're going to find a lot of people doing things, and you may see this kind of spur a lot of protests and other lawful activities or whatever that to hinder the ability of immigration enforcement within Chicago, kind of like you've seen in other places, and certainly in Southern California. We've seen a lot of these spontaneous protests and stuff that go out there and basically try to hinder the ability of immigration enforcement to do immigration enforcement.
What are you watching for next? President Trump has floated the idea of, after Chicago, he might eyeball New York City as well. What are you watching for?
I'm watching. Well, first off, I want to see our federalized National Guard troops actually going into Chicago. There's been a lot of talk, a lot of discussion. Mayor Johnson indicated that he thought that they were mobilizing or getting ready to roll into the city, so to speak. Obviously, the actions north of the city at the Great Lakes Naval Base has certainly got everybody's attention. But I'm actually see, what does that look like? How big is it? At some point we start running out of troops. If we got all these troops doing this, at some point, within any given state, you start running low on troops. That's what happened in Washington D.C., where they had to use the Emergency Mutual Assistance Compact to bring in federalized National Guard or not federalized, but I mean National Guard troops from other states to actually back up Washington D.C. because they didn't have enough National Guard troops within the city to do what they wanted to do. So I'm kind of curious to see, will there be EMAC stuff going into Illinois? And that would, and I can't imagine there would be, because I can't imagine the governor would request other troops to come in from other states under EMAC. So it would have to be some sort of federalized thing. So I'm going to watch for all of that. If there's federalization of more troops and what actually happens in Chicago. Then, of course, he has mentioned New York City. There's been a lot of speculation about Minneapolis as a potential site. So we'll see if this goes to, another city. I'm not saying this seems to be focused on just what are politically called blue state or blue cities. But
Well,
it does
every
seem to
major
be
city
following
is a blue
pattern
city.
in
You're
that regard.
talking about large population centers, they tend to be blue leaning. Doesn't matter what big city you're talking about.
To some extent, yes, but not all. I mean, if you look at there's some very large population centers in southern states that are very much red states. And, for example, I'm not holding my breath to see them go into certain areas that are more politically aligned, if you will, with the White House. But, we shall see. I think the place they're looking right now is, they've looked at Chicago and they've mentioned New York City. And so New York City would be a really interesting one. The terrain alone, and I'm going to use that term, of how they would have to go into New York City to do stuff, that is very daunting because of the surface, subsurface, and above surface terrain, the limited lines of communication or road network, the ability to move around New York City. It would be very, very challenging to do something in New York City, and it's going to be challenging to do something in Chicago, for that matter, like they did in Washington D.C. It's just geographically, in terms of urban terrain, it's just a different laydown, and I think that's going to be a big issue.
Hal Kempfer is the host of the Strap Podcast. As always, Hal, we can listen to the Strap Podcast wherever podcasts are available, but what specifically can people be listening for in the most recent episode?
Well, the most recent episode, which literally came out yesterday, is talking about, obviously focused on what just happened in Minneapolis, that horrible shooting at a religious school, a Catholic school there, and not so much focusing, on the characteristics of the shooter himself, but actually kind of getting into the missed indicators, the failure of this, the problem we have with taking proactive action, mitigating these things or preventing these things from happening, and where that failure lies. And I call it a domestic intelligence failure. And I kind of walk back in history after 9/11, some of the initiatives we had and how those have seemed to have kind of fallen off, dithered, or waned over recent years. And also how the federal money that was paying for this has been kind of moved into more normative channels, which are, rather than creating capabilities we didn't have, seem to be reinforcing or subsidizing capabilities that we've always had.